Thank you for joining us tonight for the final lecture in our autumn semester series. Through these lectures, we've encountered various ways that we engage with stuff, and stuff engages with us. From the stuff of hoaxing and fakery, design and the stuff of everyday life, social media and all its stuff, and the problems of too much stuff that emerges with hoarding, and most recently on collection and the repatriation of sacred stuff. Tonight we'll close out the semester with a talk by Bill Brown, the Karla Scherer Distinguished Service Professor in American Culture at the University of Chicago. At Chicago, Professor Brown teaches in the Department of East Asia. I started to say you're an East Asianist. Whoops, I only wish. He teaches in the Department of English Language and Literature, the Department of Visual Arts, the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and the college. He has also served as Deputy Provost for the Arts, as Deputy Dean of Academic and Research Initiatives in the Humanities, as Associate Dean of Humanities, and as Chair of the English Department. He has been a co-editor of Critical Inquiry since 1993, and his essays have appeared in a number of journals, too many to list here tonight, but his topics demonstrate his wide-ranging interest in material culture, stuff, and objects, and those that engage with it, from baseball, toys, kung fu, textual materialism, and thing theory, the fiction of Virginia Woolf and Charles Johnson, Henry James and Sean Wang, the art of Richard Tuttle, Brian Jungen, and Theaster Gates. His two books that really pertain to our series are A Sense of Things, The Object Matter of American Literature, published by Chicago in 2003, and his most recent book, Other Things, also published by Chicago in 2015. In these books, he tracks the role of objects among the visual, plastic, and literary arts, and in the fields of anthropology, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and aesthetics. Brown thinks in these books about the impact of particular objects, from mechanical banks of the 19th century to 9/11 kitsch, from Man Ray's photographs to Dan Flavin's installations. He is currently at work on Reassemblage, developing the relationship between assemblage theory in the social sciences and assemblage as an art practice, about which we'll hear more tonight. And before we welcome him to this stage, I want to remind you that during the Q&A to please wait until you have the opportunity to speak into the microphone. We are recording all of these lectures and putting them online so that we want to capture your voice on the record, so to speak. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Brown.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that introduction. And thank you, Karen, and also Jim English, and to the Wolf Humanities Center for inviting me to inhabit your forum on stuff. I'd also like to thank the signers. So given the, let's say, denotational promiscuity of stuff, its ability to designate almost anything and almost everything, I've given myself considerable license when it comes to zeroing in on a topic, sorting through a bunch of stuff, let's say, to get to the stuff that preoccupies me these days. By way of preface, let me note the obvious, that the ambiguity of stuff seems to, at least from my point of view, irrepressibly invite both adjectives and what you might call adjectival affect. One person's awful stuff, oh, that is awful stuff, can become someone else's amazing stuff. What amazing stuff! And such a transformation takes place, as we all know, at any flea market, say, or garage sale. Let me note, moreover, that stuff is also a verb, of course. I stuffed a turkey last Thursday, and a verb that appears in idioms whose significance also very often depends on adverbial affect. Oh, go stuff it, right? But when I talk about restuffing theory, I simply mean to fill what goes by the name of theory with the material world as we live it, to, let's say, thicken it a little, complicate it a little, materialize it perhaps a little. It seems intuitive then to begin with the stuffed plush toys that are part of Mike Kelly's most famous artworks, as in this close-up from his More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid and the Ages of Sin, described by the Whitney Museum as a chaotic assemblage of handmade dolls and blankets that Mike Kelly found in thrift stores, a swirling mass of unrequited affection that is beyond human reciprocation. Indeed, he stages the faces of the dolls in a way that dramatizes their unwaveringly buoyant cheer with an eye-level eye contact that seems meant to elicit both amusement and, say, empathy. More Love Hours can certainly be read as a cynical, and is typically read, and should be read, as a cynical critique of an American childhood, that is, of the American childhood, given up to kitsch and an adulthood beleaguered by nostalgia, signaled by the Indian corn quotation marks that return us to Thanksgiving. But it can be read too, I think more generally and more lightly, as the recognition of how the inanimate object world stuff supports both our material and emotional needs. That is, the Afghans supporting our material needs and the dolls our emotional needs, if not the recognition of how animate and animating that world can be. This drama of object relations gives way to a more elusive engagement with the stuff of childhood in deodorized central mass with satellites, an installation of 13 brilliantly colored hanging sculptures meticulously crafted from stuffed animals, with the room pine-scented by bright, huge, wall-mounted deodorizers. And this is from MoMA's PS1 exhibition space with a Mike Kelly retrospective that they showed in 2013. While the artificial scent might remind a viewer of the natural world on which this object world is based, that is, the plant and animal world, the sheer number of stuffed animals conveys, I think, mass-produced affection and mass-produced memory. Sewn together face down, it is as though the little critters were turning their faces away from the art spectator, who can never have the properly sensuous relation with them. In the museal world of no touching, after all, there really is nothing that is genuinely soft. Then again, as skinned hides, the composite satellites evoke a dialectic of violence and beauty, all cast within a scene that is powerfully fun, funny, and cute. And that's part of the trick of Mike Kelly always. He's making you laugh, but he's also decidedly criticizing the consumer culture we live in. Kelly's work underscores how ubiquitously, from the 1980s to the present, artists have been making use of stuff, all kinds of stuff, to make their art. Reena Banerjee shops on eBay and at cheap antique shops to gather the material that she confects into wild and wildly titled, mesmerizing assemblages. Sarah Z accumulates thousands of household objects into constellations that conjure up some alternate and self-contained reality. This was at the Biennale in Venice in 2013. Jason Dodge grabs stuff from the streets and scatters it across the gallery floor, unwilling to clean up the chaos of our culture of waste. These are decidedly distinct practices, and one could say much about each of them. But what I want to say merely is that they all seem to insist that we attend to the overlooked, to everyday stuff, to household stuff, to grubby stuff. Now, if you grew up in the West, as I have, you learned back in the 18th century from Kant that art has no purpose, right? By thinking about such practices, I find it hard not to argue that art has a pedagogical function, that it teaches us about the object world and our relations to it, providing a different regime of value within which to experience the outmoded or discarded or overlooked or thrown away. Today, when the attention to stuff has resulted in books titled Stuff by the anthropologist Danny Miller and Stuff Theory by the literary critic Maurizio Boscali, it is important to recognize how the visual and plastic arts contribute to that conversation, advancing a radical materialism of their own. So, a couple of years before finishing a book that Julie mentioned, Other Things, I really and truly meant to leave things behind. But predictably enough, I started picking them back up, not one by one, but in curious clusters, batches and bundles, aggregations and agglomerations, compilations and consolations. Whoops, no, we'll leave that, I guess. And constellations. I did so as part of a simple experiment that began with the urge to figure out how the material object world, and more specifically, the world of human artifacts, might contribute to what gets called these days assemblage theory, a theory most often inspired and informed by the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus, published in 1980, and still having a huge impact across several fields. It thus depends for its coinage on the translation of the French agencement as assemblage, rather than, say, layout or arrangement or configuration, as in un agencement de meubles, a pleasant arrangement of furniture. Quite reasonably, then, that theory has paid no mind to physical assemblages within the archaeological field or within art history. This isn't a translation of assemblage, which enters the French art idiom via Jean Dubuffet in 1956. So, given that assemblage theory today derives its name from the mildly assertive English translation by Brian Masumi, following others, of the noun agencement as assemblage, quite naturally that theory has nothing to do with assemblage in the study of material culture or in the visual and plastic arts. It has nothing to do with the artistic practice we associate with Kirch fitters. Okay, there we go. The Meersbuilder with Joseph Cornell, the boxes with Robert Rauschenberg, the combines with Daniel Spary, les tableaux pièges. It has nothing to do with Picasso, Man Ray, Louise Nevelson, Lee Bontekoe, Bruce Conner, or Noah Purifoy, a whole host of artists transforming stuff into art. The history of assemblage as artistic practice is decidedly not the prehistory of assemblage theory. But what if it were? And what if, trying to fathom this faux genealogy prompted by a slightly oblique translation, you could at least begin to sense how assemblage theory, one stripe or another, might help you to reanimate the work of familiar assemblage artists, say Rauschenberg, and to think more expansively about assemblage practice, present and past, to consider assemblage in an expanded field. And what if those assemblages, stuff to think with, could help you to apprehend that theory somewhat differently, perhaps restricting its expansiveness, pointing out some awkward seams and edges, or exposing one or another assumption, or helping to explain in affective, aesthetic, and aesthetico-political registers some of the appeal and some of the unanticipated limits of assemblage as term, fact, or trope, as deployed in, say, Manuel Delanda's A New Philosophy of Society, Assemblage Theory and Social Complexity, Jasbir Puar's Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, or Tony Sampson's The Assemblage Brain, Sense-Making and Neuroculture, or Urban Assemblages, a collection of essays that, in the words of one of its editors, Ignacio Farias, means to grasp the city anew as a hybrid chain of actants, as an object which is relentlessly being assembled at concrete sites of urban practice, and which thus means to interrupt accounts of the city provided in particular by Marxist political economy. Are there works of art, stuff to think with, that help to explain our, my, your, current attraction to the study of heterogeneous connections between objects, spaces, materials, machines, bodies, subjectivities, symbols, and the perpetually emergent condition they are said to disclose? So let me go back to one quotation and emphasize something. This is from the Urban Assemblages book. So the city becomes an object which is relentlessly being assembled. And it's the disappearance of agency there that is one of my real concerns. Okay, 2. We've already through part 1. 2. Theory practice with an oblique there. My experiment engages contemporary practices and eventually addresses the contemporary focus on the rights of assembly, sharpened by the Arab Spring and in the US by the Occupy movement. But my experimental center, or what I call the ballast of the project, is narrowly framed by the post-war era of American art and literature, indeed affixed to the year 1961, the year in which the Museum of Modern Art held its Art of Assemblage exhibition, accompanied by an important panel discussion that included Richard Holzenbeck, founder of Berlin Dada in 1917, Marcel Duchamp, and Rauschenberg. Not just the three of them, but the three of them. The moderator of that panel and the curator of the show, William Seitz, who was the first art history PhD to write a dissertation on contemporary art at Princeton, produced a catalog and essay that has become the touchstone for future assemblage exhibitions. He begins the story of modern assemblage by attending to literature, Mallarmé and Apollinaire, and pointing to their graphic and typographic practices as the prehistory of collage and assemblage work in the visual and plastic arts, traditionally understood to begin when Picasso incorporated everyday stuff, oilcloth and rope, into still life with chair caning, 1912, an image of which Seitz himself reproduces at the outset of his essay. But just as for Seitz, the recent wave of assemblage, and in particular the work of Rauschenberg, also Dubuffet, prompted him to stage a much more elaborate exhibition than he had originally planned. So too, the proliferation of what was then recent American work in the discursive arts by Kenneth Patchen, William Carlos Williams, and John Ashbery might at the very least have prompted him to conclude the book by returning to the literary field. Above all, William Burroughs, whose Naked Lunch had finally appeared in 1959, and who was performing assemblage experiments across media, photography, film, print, audio tape, scrapbooks, might well have appeared as a kind of literary hero to bring Seitz's catalog full circle. Technically and geographically, Burroughs having begun his cut-up method with Brian Geisen in 1959 at the Beat Hotel in Paris. By 1961, he was fully in the throes of extensive cut-up and fold-in projects that became the Nova Trilogy, published in 1961 to 64. The material practices for which, cutting, arranging, rearranging, and pasting, square readily, if by no means precisely, with the practice of assemblage in the plastic arts. It was, as Burroughs himself put it, a new method of writing that would allow literature to catch up with painting. So, even as Seitz inaugurated the use of assemblage, that term, to designate a wide range of practices in the visual and plastic arts, the discursive arts were participating energetically in the assemblage field. Now, Burroughs and Geisen described the method repeatedly in The Third Mind, a collection of short works that had originally appeared in journals from 1960 to 1973. They write, "You can introduce the unpredictable, spontaneous factor with a pair of scissors. The method is simple. Here is one way to do it. Take a page, like this page. Now cut down the middle and across the middle. You have 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now rearrange the sections, placing section 4 with section 1 and section 2 with section 3, and you have a new page. Here is a Rimbaud poem cut up. Visit of memories, only your dance in your voice house. On the suburban air, improbable desertions, all harmonic pine for strife. Cut-ups, they go on, are for everyone. Anyone can make cut-ups. It is experimental in the sense of being something to do. You'll soon see that words don't belong to anyone. Words have a vitality of their own, and you or anybody can make them gush into action. Such a focus on materials themselves appears across assemblage practices. Rauschenberg explains to Barbara Rose, I recognize the individuality of all objects, which is what I think my art is about. It becomes a friend. Rauschenberg speaks of the self-accumulating, self-happening, self-organizing power of the object. So one democratizing claim, effacing the distinction between the artist and everyone, accompanies another, granting the object no less vitality than the subject. And now, by adding Burroughs and Geisen to the assemblage field, my experiment had to begin again, recognizing the impact that Burroughs made on Deleuze and Guattari, who not only refer to him in their preface to Mille Plateau, but also describe their collaboration as though they were repeating the experiment that Burroughs and Geisen had performed on their way to composing The Third Mind. Published by Viking in 1978, but originally published in a French language edition of Croiset in 1976. Deleuze and Guattari write, we are no longer ourselves. Each morning we would wake up and each of us would ask himself what plateau he was going to tackle, writing 5 lines here, 10 there. We had hallucinatory experiences. We watched lines leave one plateau and proceed to another like columns of tiny ants. Burroughs and Geisen had written, "The third mind is there when two minds collaborate. We are collaborating on this manual of elementary illusion techniques. The first step in the recreation is to cut the old lines that hold you right where you are sitting now." There is then, on the discursive plane, something productively dialectical about the theory and practice of assemblage, especially given how Burroughs' own machinic theorizations of technique rhyme with Deleuze and Guattari's subsequent description of the book itself as a little machine, or the way that abstract machines by their light make the territorial assemblage open onto something else, assemblages of another sort, the molecular, the cosmic, they constitute becomings. Which is to say that assemblage practice turns out, after all, to form something of the prehistory of assemblage theory. Nope. Sorry, my numbers are just not corresponding. And indeed, Deleuze and Guattari describe their book, always referred to as the book, le livre, not notre livre, not our book, as an assemblage, agencement, a multiplicity that establishes connections between certain multiplicities and has no sequel, nor the world as its object, nor one or several authors as its subject. The book is an active arrangement, a configuring made of various formed matters in very different dates and speeds, with lines of strata and territories, but also lines of flight. The simple point I mean to emphasize here is that, in its inaugural moment, assemblage theory, informed by assemblage practice, presents itself as practice. All right, that was a bit of a tour, but I hope you got the sound. So, impact on Burroughs, but also mimicking the sort of aura that Burroughs and Geisen are able to generate in the third mind. Okay, 3. John Locke deploys assemblage, the term, in 1704, explaining how wit lies foremost in the assemblage of ideas and putting those together with quickness and variety, as opposed to judgment, which lies in separating carefully one from another ideas wherein can be found the least difference. While such a distinction remains salient insofar as assemblage efforts, theory and practice, mean to diverge from reason as usual, and insofar as wit certainly animates the work of Rauschenberg and Burroughs, Deleuze and Guattari, Locke's usage has pretty much become anachronistic as the term has gained technical specificity within archaeology, within the art world, and within political and social theory. So while assemblage connotes a kind of heterogeneous composite within the sphere of art, in the field of archaeology, the term denotes, most simply, a kind of minimal coherence, a group of things found in association, most generally applied to a collection of artifacts or ecofacts, animal bones or seeds, etc., recovered from a specific archaeological context, a site, an area within a site, a stratified deposit. So an assemblage is a collection of material stuff related through contextual proximity. Artifacts are typologically grouped. Groups that come from one time and place are designated assemblages, and assemblages are used to designate archaeological cultures. Archaeologists write of faunal assemblages, ceramic assemblages, insect assemblages, stone tool assemblages, with less specificity of object assemblages, with more of macrofaunal, bone assemblages, and phytolith assemblages. The term, originally borrowed from geology by John Lubbock in the 1860s, became increasingly debated and refined in the 1950s, after which the processual and post-processual developments in the field of archaeology, let's say 1970 to early 2000s, focused above all on questions of deposition of assemblage formation. As Rosemary Joyce puts it, ambivalence is inherent in the use of the term assemblage, which references the verb assemble, raising the question of who is doing the assembling. The answer to such a question always lies in the past. The assemblage results from ritual practice, or from work, or from play, or from disposal. And it also lies in the present. It results from the work of the archaeologist. The assemblage has been assembled perceptually and analytically by the scholar or scholars in the field. Further, the question of who is doing the assembling, the population responsible for the midden, can elide the question of what is doing the assembling, given that, for instance, artifacts can accumulate at one place in time as the result of a flood. Even such an abbreviated account of the term's deployment within archaeology raises questions for other fields about assemblage formation as about agency. When Deleuze and Guattari transposed Freud's story of little Hans into various assemblages, a machinic assemblage, draft, horse, omnibus, street, they clearly assemble the assemblage. Indeed, they wonder about other assemblage possibilities. Is there as yet an unknown assemblage that would be neither Hans nor the horses, but that of the becoming horse of Hans? So the point is, assemblages aren't simply discovered, they are assembled. The art world provides the most familiar understanding of assemblage as a three-dimensional work composed in part or whole of already existing objects. So that's Rauschenberg's collection from 1955 on the left and monogram 55 to 59 on the right. Assemblage has close affinities, of course, with two-dimensional collage and filmic montage. Both coinages, Braque and Picasso coined collage, Kuleshov coined montage, from the second decade of the 20th century. Since the Dubuffet coinage, assemblage has been used to identify retroprojectively a large body of work from the Cubists, Futurists, Surrealists, and Dadaists. In The Art of Assemblage, William Seitz adopted the term out of necessity, he writes, as a generic term that would include all forms of composite art and modes of juxtaposition. Writing to museums, galleries, and collectors before the exhibition, he described it as including many varieties of collage and construction found from objects, and the accompanying book as the first to survey the diverse types of assembled art. A diversity that included objects of popular, primitive, or historical art, which resembled modern collages and assembled objects. Seitz came to assemble a range of material under the rubric of assemblage, a rubric that has retained its potency. By now, assemblage, along with abstraction, can readily be credited as one of the two most significant formal innovations of 20th century art. So what I'm trying to track there, which is tracking, not tracking because it doesn't really track, going through Seitz's correspondence to the museums as he's putting together the assemblage show, is he doesn't know yet what he's going to call it. He says, oh, assembled objects, collage-like objects, composite stuff, and then ultimately does. So in the catalog, Seitz writes of the liberation of objects and of the way that assemblage, incorporating non-art materials within the work, breaks down the discrepancy between the actual and the fictional, between the permanent and the ephemeral, and between art and non-art, expressing a dissatisfaction ranging from impatience to nihilism, with limitations traditionally imposed by the idea of art, the sequestered atmosphere, and geometric enframement of the museum. Further, he argues that assemblage is a method with disconcertingly centrifugal possibilities. When paper is soiled or lacerated, when cloth is worn, stained, or torn, when wood is split, weathered, or patterned with peeling coats of paint, when metal is bent or rusted, they gain connotations which unmarked materials lack. Extrapolating from his description, you can say that within an assemblage, there are internal relations that constitute the assemblage as such, and external relations which fragment, each fragment having once belonged somewhere else and to something else. It is not difficult to differentiate between centripetal and centrifugal assemblages, between, say, a Cornell box that brings fragments of the world within a frame that acts as a kind of window, and a Rauschenberg combine where the fragments rupture the frame and gesture out. In Cornell's untitled Hotel Eden, 1945, the green parrot, cut out of the lithograph and affixed to wood, perches in the center of the box, behind glass, attentive, it seems, to what's within the box. In Rauschenberg's Satellite, a stuffed pheasant minus its tail stands at the ledge that forms the upper frame of the painted surface. In Canyon, the stuffed eagle protrudes horizontally and aggressively from the stretched canvas. Of course, the two forces operate together. Rauschenberg has painted both birds, drawing them back into the work, as it were, sustaining some centripetal force with a reterritorializing gesture. And to make the point that way is to suggest that the discrepancy between centripetal and centrifugal forces can be mapped onto that between the territorializing and deterritorializing forces that became so central to Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of assemblages. Their emphasis on how formation is perpetually in the midst of transformation, deformations and reformations, can help us to convey the sense in which Rauschenberg aspired to something kinetic. Paint is a nuisance, he said in one interview, because it keeps drying and setting. Whoops, okay. Well, I think the issue is that I don't have my most recent slides, which is fine. I just had some blanks. Fun to look at Canyon for a while. So when it comes to the use of assemblage within social theory, and I'm going to keep this really quite short, and Manuel de Landa is standing in for a very large body of theory. This evening, I'm just going to stick with de Landa, who powerfully and productively simplifies Mille-Plateau and deploys assemblage to emphasize composition and dynamic relation rather than totality, organization rather than organism, assemblages being composed of heterogeneous elements or objects that enter into relations with one another. De Landa begins a new philosophy of society, assemblage theory, and social complexity by saying that the purpose of the book is to provide a novel approach to social ontology. And by ontology, he means it this way. What is a city? A city is an assemblage, right? And he thinks we should not be using the word city, right? We should, because they're assemblages. To use the word city is to contain what's actually going on. An aggressively realist ontology such as his, committed to the mind-independent existence of reality, means that his social ontology must describe social entities without the theories and models made available by, say, sociology or anthropology or common sense. No ideas, but in things, you might say. He thus avoids the use of concepts like the state, which is, I'm quoting, important not only because such reified generalities are not legitimate ontological entities, but also because such notions are too monolithic. That is, they fail to capture the relations of exteriority that exist among the heterogeneous organizations forming a government hierarchy. These relations of exteriority are what Deleuze and Guattari call deterritorializing forces and what Seitz calls centrifugal force. For de Landa, the identity of an assemblage is always contingent, for a component part of an assemblage may be detached and plugged into a different assemblage in which its interactions are different. In other words, the exteriority of relations implies a certain autonomy for the terms they relate. So I was trying to make that a little closer to home, and so you could argue similarly that the university is too monolithic a term, which you sense working for the university when you read about how the university is gentrifying the neighborhood, whereas you yourself have external relations with groups that are fighting just that gentrification. De Landa describes a multi-scaled social reality with assemblages operative at every level, city, town, person, so both down and up. From my point of view, what is important about such work is how it posits an ontology of relation that recognizes the dynamics of recomposition. For the term that Julie mentioned, reassemblage, that I've come to deploy as the key word of my experiment, means to mark first the apparently irrepressible return to this artistic mode that was so productive in the early 20th century for Schwitters, Man Ray, etc. But it means to mark second, and more importantly, how the assemblage, including the artwork, is fashioned from other assemblages. The Rauschenberg Combine has disassembled the newspaper or the metal box, or whatever, taking apart and relocating it within another assemblage. Now, in the panel discussion at MoMA that accompanied the Art of Assemblage show, Duchamp proclaimed that any painting is an assemblage. Since the tubes of paint used by the artist are manufactured in ready-made products, we must conclude that all paintings in the world are ready-mades, aided, and also works of assemblage. However comic, and I think it is comic, meant to be comic, it's also completely valid. And yet it quickly evacuates assemblage of any phenomenological, let alone art historical force. And surely you need, at least I'm guessing you want, the term and the concept to differentiate, say, the work of Nelson from that of Helen Frankenthaler, the work of Rauschenberg from that of Mark Rothko. Which is why assemblage effect, with a hyphen, might end up proving an important way of retaining the specificity of a certain kind of work, even as it would then seem to ask of de Landa's argument that it complicates its ontology, nothing but assemblage, through phenomenological, epistemological, and aesthetic grids, where assemblages appear assemblage-like. Through an assemblage analytic, you might understand the city as such to be an assemblage. But I bet you find Philadelphia more assemblage-like than New Hope. Thus, even as assemblage theory contributes to how you interrogate works of assemblage, those works and the history of assemblage practice, its exhibition, its analysis, can help to leaven certain theoretical, in fact, really philosophical claims. So, once you've been thinking about assemblage for a while, as I have, it becomes pretty clear that these days the term risks being too capacious. Or you might say, by now assemblage has assembled different kinds of claims that merit some disaggregation. One point of my overarching experiment, then, is to disassemble assemblage and to generate a practicable taxonomy. Okay, so assemblage can be used to assert an ontological claim. So Duchamp proclaims that all painting is assemblage. Delanda argues that all urban forms simply are assemblages. An assemblage can be used epistemologically. Within Hume's empiricism, for instance, our convictions about cause and effect, as about external objects, lie in the aggregation of experiences and the associative relations of ideas. An assemblage can be used psychologically, as in Freud's metapsychology, or in William James's understanding of the proprietary material self, wherein I cannot distinguish between me and mine. An assemblage can be understood phenomenologically as the process whereby we experience the world as the world, the perceptions organized by your sensorium into a mug, a barn, say, a bottle, what Hegel understands as the way our perception organizes properties, property of color, size, shape, into an entity that is in fact a community. An assemblage can be used analytically, by which I mean that you can adopt an assemblage analytic or an assemblage optic in order to perceive the painting, the sonata, the novel, the city, the personal identity in its assemblage form. Assemblage can name a practice from spolia to quilting to intricate collage to monumental assemblage. An assemblage can be used aesthetically to caption assemblage effects. Those effects, as I understand them, are the experience of heterogeneity, where phenomena don't resolve into material, imagistic, or sonic unity. So both Eisenstein and Vertov use and theorize montage, for instance. But Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera dramatizes obvious and adamant assemblage effects. So in Delanda's more recent assemblage theory from 2016, he confronts a conundrum that remained unexpressed in a new philosophy of society. What if assemblages, he writes there, are no more than the illusions, state, city, they appear to debunk? What if assemblage is just another reified generality? The concept itself is a product of our minds and would not exist without them, he writes, but concrete assemblages must be considered to be fully independent of our minds. Here, though, the realist ontology works not by argument, but by assertion, must be considered. And surely you can have faith that the world enjoys a mind-independent reality, I do, while adopting a pragmatist Jamesian perspective, asking, for instance, what are the conceptual affordances of assemblage? What does an assemblage analytic enable you to think, and what might it prevent you from thinking? Practice. Robert Rauschenberg, Elias Simé. So according to Leon Dickerman, co-curator of the 2016 Rauschenberg retrospective, Tate Modern MoMA, SF MoMA, when you open a gallery and see the art that's made out of the stuff of the real world, that's coming off the walls, that's interdisciplinary in its approach, all that is the legacy of Rauschenberg. She might be overstating it, but there's something to that. And there's certainly something to be said about Rauschenberg lying behind much of today's assemblage and installation work. When it comes to his own career, I want to emphasize, though, as Brandon Joseph has, the importance of kinetic activity. Thus, for the composer John Cage, the pre-Combine white paintings, first exhibited at the Stable Gallery in 1953, were significant not as an attack on the history of painting, but as mirrors of the air, airports for lights, shadows, particles, dust. In other words, as sites of ever-changing assembly, sites for accumulating ever-changing assembly. His understanding allows us to imagine the subsequent combines as the active iteration of that passive scene, a move from assemblage as the ubiquitous case to particularized cases of assemblage. More simply and perhaps more saliently, Rauschenberg pursued his combine work while pursuing performance work, collaborating with Cage at Black Mountain College on theater piece number 1, 1951, where the white paintings provided a backdrop. He subsequently and repeatedly collaborated with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, providing light, set, and costume design, most famously the freestanding combine that he created for Minucci, 1954, made from fabric, collage, red paint, comic strips, a performance object, as he called it, in relation to which dancers moved around, in, out, and around again. Rauschenberg himself produced Pelican for the Judson Dance Theater in 1963 with one woman, Carolyn Brown, on point, and two men, Rauschenberg himself, there on the right, and Alex Hayden, on roller skates with parachutes attached to their backs. Other performance pieces, Elgin Ty, Map Room 2, with a shout out to Getty, unfolded as cumbersome, dynamic assemblages of human and non-human material as heterogeneous connections between objects, spaces, materials, machines, bodies, subjectivities, symbols. The human, non-human cyborgs, what one critic called locomotive human combines, function awkwardly at best with technology misused in what Rauschenberg called the tire walk, for instance, to dramatize the limit of effective subject-object relations, the recalcitrance of stuff, the limit of any human dominion over the simplest parts of our man-made object world. Thus, even as assemblage thinking helps you to emphasize the instability, contingency, and mobility in Rauschenberg's work, that work, from my point of view, helps you to recognize that reassembly doesn't enjoy the ease, the fluidity, and flexibility that it enjoys in ontologizing accounts of socio-material assemblages. So finally now, as I turn back to the present, I want to do so with a distinct privilege of humanistic inquiry, a metacritical frame that encourages you to ask why you are asking the questions you ask. What is the material unconscious that provokes and informs those questions? When it comes to an interest in assemblage, such questions have several obvious, yet I think significant answers. One answer is that we live in a cut and paste era. Not only do we inhabit a musical culture of sampling, a communication culture of retweeting, an image culture where you and your friends can be photoshopped into the picture and back out, we have all become irrepressible collagistes. On the computer screen, you arrange and rearrange a sentence, a paragraph, a paper. Cut up and folded methods have become routine, however virtual, and however arduously they get deployed, not to expose juxtaposition, but to hide it, to efface the seams. So you might thus say that today's assemblage art stages a contrasting materialist mode where seams show, where the fact and the work of assembly is not patched over, sanded smooth, sutured, effaced. Of course, what gets called the oceanic digital accumulations of our image culture also has a material dimension, violently evident in the corollary physical accumulations, e-waste, which has become America's fastest growing waste stream, a stream of toxic stuff that most typically finds its way to China, yes, but also Ghana, Nigeria, Liberia, Ethiopia. That accumulation highlights the significance of Elias Simei's contribution to today's assemblage imaginary. He has become best known for his massive collages made from electronic detritus, circuit boards, braided wire, screws, batteries, computer keys. As one reviewer put it, the Ethiopian artist makes visible both the hardware and the hard-to-stomach consequences of the first world's wanton electronics consumption. When Simei's work appears in the West, particularly in the US, it confronts you with the history of exported waste, with the insides of computers, the stuff inside your old MacBook, with material platforms, with the materiality of media, and work that sometimes resembles a motherboard, sometimes a map or an aerial view of a city, and sometimes a Papunyatula dot dream painting from Australia. The work can be vaguely figurative or all but monochromatically, exquisitely abstract. Growing up in the Ethiopian neighborhood of Cherkos, Sime used the open market there as a source for supplies. I'm quoting from an interview. When the merchants leave the market at the end of the day, they leave their trash all over the ground. For me, this was the most exciting part of the day. I collected anything I found. The more interesting, the better. I made art with it. Until the early 1990s, Sime was most inclined to scour the market to accumulate fabric, buttons, wood, and bottle caps for his work. And there's quite a bit of work before this work, including some very large sculptures. He continues to add such bits, that is, things like buttons, to the reclaimed electrical components. And those components typically have been gathered from the sprawling open-air Mikado in the capital city of Addis Ababa. There is, I think, something utopian, let's say, about the beauty, the scale, and the sheer audacity of his more recent work. At once dramatizing the materiality of our new technology, deeply registering the magnitude of e-waste, and yet conveying the possibility that waste might yet be reconfigured, re-experienced within some new regime of value. Truly dreadful stuff becomes really remarkable stuff. Of course, this practice evokes the image of Older Breton at the flea market and Walter Benjamin's account of the surrealist discovery of the revolutionary potential of the outmoded. It evokes no less an African tradition of salvage and recycling. And yet, close proximity to work like Typewrote 7 can hardly fail to mesmerize as an act of modern labor within the global market. The offshored and outsourced labor of assembly, the African labor of disassembly, and Elias Sime's own labor of artistic reassembly. This is to close, then, with the plea that assemblage theory not ignore the long history in our contemporary history, not just of assemblage practice, but of assembly, often degrading, sometimes inspiring, but decidedly a very human act. Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I'm still kind of composing my question in my mind, so I'll just talk it out loud here. But I'm thinking as I'm watching all of this art, I'm thinking of Hannah Hawk, and I'm thinking of the tradition of kind of scrapbooking, Victorian scrapbooking with women, and I'm thinking of weaving, and I'm thinking of textiles.
Quilting.
Yes, totally. But I'm not seeing a lot of it in the kind of dialogue that you're putting together here between a 20th century artistic tradition and theory. And so I'm just wondering if it serves as a counter-narrative to the kind of flows that you're articulating between theory and art in the period, or if it resists that in some way, or how do we place kind of women's work into
Right, thank you for the question. And there is, in the bigger project, there is more women's work in the project, but it is certainly the case that it is still absolutely the 1961 who are the assemblage artists who get the most attention. And then when it comes to contemporary work, I'm not thinking, could be, thinking of like women textile artists, but it's more Tara Donovan, Sarah Z, Rena Banerjee. But do I think that that would be a counter-narrative to the narrative that I'm narrating? I think it would add to it. I don't think it would necessarily be a counter-narrative, because I'm imagining that the history of assemblage as a practice is the not counter-narrative, but the congesting narrative to what's happened to assemblage theory, right? And so, and it would decidedly include scrapbooking and quilting, and it would also include things like spolia, right, from an ancient world. So, but yes, thank you for the question. So absolutely, there's a place in this project right now. It's because of the history, because in 1961 you get a book And then you have Burroughs, who ends up being the inspiration, I think, a kind of inspiration for Deleuze and Guattari. It's very male-centric in this version.
I couldn't help but notice in your account of the disassembling of assemblage that one approach wasn't listed, and that was the social historical. And I also couldn't help but note what seemed to be a particular density at the time that you, as your project itself begins, note around the art of assemblage and those figures. And furthermore, that almost every one of the figures that you mentioned was a gay man in the 1950s. Geisen, Cage, Johns, Rauschenberg, on and on. And I'm wondering to what extent the theoretical frame that you're developing can encompass a social historical account that looks at questions of sexuality as, in some sense, finding forms of resolution in assemblage. Assemblage allowing the making of multiple levels of signification available to different audiences with different competencies.
Yeah, thanks. No, there's definitely room in this project for that also, and it already exists in the project, not here. My point about Rauschenberg really is that when he's moving from assemblages that are, as it were, just material to socio-material assemblages, when he's working with Cunningham, for instance, in particular, that it's not just, in Brendan Joseph's account, an effort to not be fettered by paint, but it's also an effort to be in contact with people. Very much so. And it's also the case that, I mean, as you know, it's the case that already he is incorporating other artists' work into some of the pieces, into some of his pieces, famously so. And it is also the case that certainly something, I mean, it's debated, but I'm definitely on one side of the debate with something like Canyon. It's very, very coded to be, as it were, assembling a particular audience around it who will have a different knowledge of it from people who don't know the code, right? So yes, absolutely right, absolutely right. And I think, and that's what I feel that the social theory can help when it comes to the art history, because I think it is actually helpful to start thinking about not Jackson Pollock, Robert Rauschenberg, not just as an assemblage artist who is assembling material, but also as an assemblage artist who is assembling people, right? And that's why when it comes to the present, somebody like Theaster Gates's work is really important to me because, I mean, he's a potter, he's an assemblage artist selling things in galleries and things are hung in museums, but he also assembles people for plate convergences and musical performances and things like that. So that has very, very much a social component to it. And I think pretty much informed by something like some of Rauschenberg's efforts. Not the efforts to code, but the efforts to gather people together in a empty space to start figuring out what a dance might be.
Multiple people are pointing. Thanks. I had just one reference in relation to this last work. There's an Ethiopian artist, Susina Solomon, who's based here in Philadelphia, who has a work called Mercato that is a juxtaposition of documentary film footage in the Ethiopian market, in the Addis Ababa market, with
kind of installation that is an assemblage made out of kind of the remnants from that market, where she
Right.
rebuilds a market and creates an assemblage point for the audience for the film, and brings in women and grandmothers to make
Right.
Ethiopian bread and coffee. So it might be an interesting counterpoint to think about the extent to which assemblage has to involve transformation or reproduction or something like that. I don't know, so I thought I'd mention that. But my question is about just a kind of passing comment where you were talking about Sykes, and you distinguish between marked and unmarked materials. And I think you were talking about literal markings. But it made me think about Peggy Phelan's work in relation to bodies and who gets to be an unmarked or a marked body. And I wondered what it would mean to extend that question into the realm of stuff and to think about what it takes to be an unmarked object,
Right.
what that would mean, and how that might impact assemblage theory in the way that it engages stuff.
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. I mean, I can imagine in response to that something, I could imagine saying, oh, well, actually, like commodities are unmarked, or many of them are, and they get marked by being, brought into an assemblage, that it can become a way of marking, which would definitely not be the way Seitz is thinking about it, but I think would be a very, very interesting way of thinking about it. And thank you for the reference, and I'll get that in writing.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could touch on the idea of, to sort of parallel the art post-1961 and theory post-1960s, the ideas of the universal and the particular with regard to assemblage theory and within the formal qualities of art production. So the idea of a post-1960s kind of turn toward or more of a awareness of or regard to maybe global modes of thinking and theory, and then the idea of kind of within the practice of assemblage, universalizing the particular, which is to say individual components composing a whole, and forming perhaps maybe a new kind of particular kind of moment. I'm interested in kind of the ideas of the universal and the particular with respect to what you said about Deleuze and Guattari specifically.
Okay, I'm not so sure about universal, but I think particular and something else, right? I mean, particular and universal, universal sounds to me too grand or grandiose. But I do think absolutely that part of what like Rauschenberg is doing when he, for instance, in Canyon puts a photograph of his son in the picture, he's definitely deploying the hyper-private and particular into something that is, that among other things, so maybe we can get to universal, will have a formal register within that assemblage, right? I mean, it does, the photograph does, among other things, become a square, and it is a very little boy reaching up in relation to a photograph from a newspaper of the Statue of Liberty reaching the other way. So in that, if one can go talk formally, then maybe to the universal, but certainly that move is a Rauschenberg move over and over again. The Man with the White Shoes, actually untitled, but that curious closet-like piece of his is completely autobiographical and has lots of, but it is also, in terms of form and color, an arresting object, like from the distance. So Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, they're too, I don't think universal. I mean, I think that, although when I'm teaching Deleuze and Guattari, I always say you have to be thinking of them as cosmologists, which they're not, and they don't talk about the cosmos. But if you imagine the Big Bang and then things starting to glom together, and I feel as though that's a way of thinking about their version of assemblage theory, which is never theorized by them, right? I mean, they deploy the term assemblage, but it really is a different generation. It's like Delanda's generation that is producing assemblage theory, making use of certain, you could say, theoretical scenes within Deleuze and Guattari. But there doesn't, I mean, there is no totality. And in that sense, I want to drift away from the universal. But thank you, that's a good.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in that move you made towards the end to the cut and paste era. And I'm thinking about the term assemblage. I find the term so fascinating because it's weirdly analog, it's mechanistic, it's haptic,
Right.
but it's also digital, it's networks, it's cellular forms.
Right.
And I was wondering if, so 1961, if computing or technological history matters to the story you're telling. So IBM introduces the first 64-bit computer in 61, and I think the first person goes to space, and there's the type ball typewriter, which this is just sort of threading three different things together, but I wonder if the term itself has such traction now, in part because it's a relay between the analog and the digital, and if that's part of what's happening in the artwork, or if that's something different that we're doing now.
Right. No, I mean, I think that the resonance is real, and I think that the history is important. And then there's another part of the art history which I don't like, but which is completely relevant to what you said. And that is that when, well, as you know, Burroughs' cut-up method is often thought of as being, like a computer, machinic. And people will point to that history and say, and when Rauschenberg starts doing the silk screening, which he learns from Warhol, and produces, Rauschenberg prints are drop-dead gorgeous, right? And he makes so many of them. And that too is thought of as something that people will claim, or I've read it somewhere, both Burroughs and Rauschenberg are anticipating, our digital age. I want to say, well, yes and no. I mean, and to me, it's still a question about whether or not it's a good or a bad thing that Rauschenberg started making prints. Good or bad for me. And it's definitely good for him. But I think it's completely relevant, and I have to say, I don't quite know how one would, untangle the history, but I think you're absolutely right about, 1960 or 1961 being, that is a key year in many different planes. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi. I just took a peek at the MoMA website, and that Assemblage show was about 20% women. So I would encourage you to consider them more. But I'm really curious actually about issues of class in this regard, because there are so many working class, underclass, poor people who have created art that has entered the market and has influenced the avant-garde out of the detritus surrounding them that was available to them. Outside of this context that Sime is working in, but particularly here in the United States. And I'm curious how those types of practices factor into your thinking.
Well, thank you. There's one practice which I spend in the bigger version of this, a great deal of time on, but it's still right through, Seitz's catalog. And in Seitz's catalog, he remarkably includes the Watts Towers, right? And then in 65, you have the Watts riots. And then in 66, you have 66 signs of neon. And so where Noah Purifoy and Judson Powell are taking the detritus from the Watts riots, burned junk, and not just themselves making assemblage pieces from it, but getting lots of people to do that. And the claim there from Purifoy is that this becomes a way of teaching people how artistic creation can give them hope. So absolutely, there is that story that is part of this story. Yeah. And that to me is the best instance of it, because it's very specific. It's very much coming out of 61 as far as a reference, but then it's LA. And it's a show that is supposed to be shown at Markham High School. It is shown at Markham High School, but then it tours all over Los Angeles. And Purifoy himself ends up being a very powerful assemblage artist.
Hi, thanks. It was a really great talk and really provocative. I found myself sort of circling back around this moment in the middle of it where you were asking what is, excluded when you have this super capacious, concept. And I was thinking about the whole, and just wanted to ask where the whole comes back in either the artistic practices you're looking at or in the conceptual architecture of the project. Because I guess the integral whole, right, the non-assembled whole, the particle, the monad, whatever, whether as the objects which are being projected as being assembled by specific artistic practices, or as the objects which are being created and generated as a result of artistic practices.
Well, I don't think the whole comes back. But this is what I would say. That one of the contributions that I wasn't able here to spend enough time with the theory to talk about what I imagine the art helping us with, right? But one thing is a version of whole, which is to say, a version of whole, which is to say, you could say that art piece is contained and a whole, right? And doesn't have to be in a like old-fashioned way of saying a whole, just like, well, it's a whole, right? I would want to say, well, actually, I would like to adopt an assemblage analytic and explain that it's not a whole. Not only is it, and the point here is not that it's made of composite pieces, but that it wouldn't be art at all without things like the institutions, via Arthur Danto, that make it an artwork with the gallery space, James Cahn's gallery in New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, it's not whole. It is connected to lots of other things, right? So, but what is important to me about its, let's say, relative wholeness, the fact that it is contained and at rest, is that that's where I never find the assemblage theorists or the urban geographers, really, willing to stop, right? It's as though, everything is assembling and reassembling, and parts are detaching and reassembling with something else, and I get it. It's just, I'm not sure that's the world we inhabit. Because I think we also inhabit worlds where, we come up against stuff that resists, right? And so I don't think there's enough resistance or a sense of resistance within, let's say, high assemblage theory, by which I mean to land. And now lots and lots of people are using the term. And some using it to get at what you might say not a very complicated idea of hybrid.
Thank you. Excuse my ignorance, but the 1961, was it MoMA where the panel took place?
Yes.
Okay, and the three participants were who?
So there were more than three participants, but Rauschenberg, Marcel Duchamp, and Richard Holzenbeck.
Okay.
Also Richard Shattuck was there.
And so what was the outcome of that particular panel? What progressed from that panel moment on? Was the idea of assemblage, taken on by the contemporary world and brought forward? What specifically came out of that particular moment?
Well, I think it's a great panel conversation, and I would definitely not say that much comes from it. That is, I don't think it's now they have figured out what assemblage is and they're giving it to the world. Rauschenberg is playing bad boy. Duchamp is, saying, oh, well, everything is an assemblage, right? So I would say it's not really that moment either. It's much more like a decade later, in the 70s, where you start seeing other assemblage shows, and they're really using the term the way Seitz was using it. I think, you know, part of the curiosity of the show and of the panel is that people are not calling a lot of that work assemblage art until Seitz is putting it in a show called The Art of Assemblage, right? And so part of, I mean, what his is a very sort of imperial gaze, incorporating lots of different material into that show, which some people, you know, I mean, you know, collage, for instance, is collage assemblage? Well, according to Seitz, it is.
What was the reaction what was the reaction of the community of that after that point, the artistic world? Was there great criticism directed toward that, or was it, you know, just what did the critics say?
To the panel or to the show or both? Both. It was a highly regarded show. There was some, you know, laughter about it, but it was also a highly regarded show. You know, I think it's a show that is clearly meant to dramatize the degree to which abstract expressionism is being fought by not just by pop, but by assemblage artists. You know.
Are you saying paralleling super institutions with like what you're terming assemblage is bad?
No, I'm not saying.
I mean like in simple words. I mean not bad, good, boring, but like.
Yeah. No, yeah, I'm saying that it's actually very productive, right?
Okay.
On the one hand, right? As I said, you know, the university. Well, what you know? So like, you know, if you're in the university but you're not doing what the university is doing, that to me is a way you feel your autonomy and also your capacity to have relations with other things than the university, and you have lots of them, right? So that's good. But I also think that...
Wait, you got to slow down for me. You're saying that if you, individual, you're saying I am the university, that's good?
No, I'm saying that the point of an assemblage analytic looking at the university, but an assemblage analytic, you would see the conglomeration of lots of people and books and buildings, all of which have connections to lots of everything else, right? To the infrastructure of the city of Philadelphia, for instance, right? So that's good, right? But, and I think it's productive. But I also feel as though when it comes to something like the city, also the university, there are, for instance, jurisdictional boundaries that still make it a city or make it a university, right? That simultaneously, I think you have to recognize that the city is something that is self-contained, is bordered, at the same time that it's anything but self-contained. Because, for instance, Toronto completely depends on the tar sands of Alberta, right? So that dependency, I think, is really, really important to render visible. But that doesn't mean that Toronto disappears as a body, you know, when it comes to laws. So, you know, so effectively I want it both ways. What I have felt is that saying that the state is just reifying generality and ditto the city and ditto the person is too much. It's like overkill. And that's why I think, you know, from my point of view, that's why one of the reasons why assemblage art is helpful. Because it's all process, but there are moments where things stop.
Well, you have to have like your idea of assemblage theory, like post-Burroughs, would be like where Burroughs makes the joke that he's trying to catch writing up with painting, is that like painting materialistically is functioning as one object, and the assemblage is in that totality of object. So it's not related to component pieces, where when Burroughs cuts things up, the writing up to make the assemblage, he materializes concepts by creating component pieces. So that's how you're saying assemblage functions is as a collection of component pieces, and as you move the components or reorganize the components or rename them, then you can have the city as its solid object.
I mean,
and its
Burroughs is a
subject.
good example because Burroughs basically self-plagiarizes 4 novels in a row, right? Not quite. But he keeps using the same material. He wrote the material. But he cuts it up and folds it in one way, and then he's, there's a lot of Naked Lunch in The Ticket That Exploded, and bits and pieces. I mean, he's adding things. But what I like about that is let's say, a reassemblage stream. Assembling, reassembling, reassembling, reassembling. But you also get, here's a novel, here's a novel, here's a novel, here's a novel. Well, they are bound and can be experienced as novels, as a certain kind of novel, but it's still also just like, one long process. And he's also, it has lots of other material that isn't Burroughs's in it also, which he's just cut up and folded in.
Thanks very much. Just during this last question, I started thinking about the state of the organic, or how the organic enters into your understanding of the assemblage, because it seems to me that when I read assemblage theory, it often has a position vis-a-vis talking about organisms or life, whereas your understanding of assemblage seems to be very much more mechanical. It eschews an idea of a whole, as you said in an answer to an earlier question. I'm wondering, I want to hear your take on...
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the question. Well, assemblage theory is pretty allergic to organism, right? I mean, it is organization versus organism, right? And as a result, you really don't see, even though you certainly have in Deleuze and Guattari, you have key tropes of the rhizome, key distinctions, the rhizomic versus the arboreal are coming from the natural world. But there too, the point is really, or their thrust is really resisting anything that would be a biological understanding of unit and total. So that's where this theory is.